Hey, Jim.
Hi.
How are you?
Fine. Things are a little strange in our capital city.
Yes, they are. But
You know, they're resuming their sessions at 8 o'clock, which is exactly what they should do. They have to go back to business.
yeah,
Screw
I
these
was
guys.
I was just watching the news and heard that 8 o'clock is the
Right.
schedule to.
So you may notice my eyes drifting to a different screen.
Yeah, so that's not because you're drunk. It's because you're busy with something else.
Right. But I'm going to be good, and I'll use the closed captioning on that. So
Okay.
you won't have to hear it.
Hey, Paola. Hello, Keith.
Hi, Happy New Year, everyone. Nice to see you guys.
Happy New Year.
Hello,
Happy New Year.
Lion.
New Year, all.
Vivian, how are you?
Maybe she doesn't hear us.
I don't know. She's unmuted. Can you hear us, Vivian?
Yes, but I need to shut off NPR. Hold on. It's hard to shut it off, but yes. Sorry.
Vivian, I just emailed you the agenda a little while ago. Did you get it?
I got it. Thank you. And I even
You're
shared
welcome.
it with Jim Berlin just for
Okay.
once. I wouldn't do that normally.
Okay. Well, actually, I forwarded to everyone the email that Paola sent to me. Because I don't know if they got it or not, or if they looked at their email. So, c'est la vie, c'est la guerre.
Wayne, are you in Cuba right now?
No, I'm in Old San Juan.
Oh, I've been there. Oh, nice. Got to check where you are. I thought you were across the street, but I guess not.
It's like, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? It's where in the world is Wayne Benjamin?
Exactly. And we all want to know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Where is Wayne?
Oh, Wayne's World, right.
Well, if I can't travel for real, I can travel. I can, remember where I've been. How about that?
Yeah.
I missed the postcards, though. I have 10 years worth of postcards from you that I collect.
I couldn't go anywhere last year. I'm sorry.
I know. But I still have them. I hold them dear. It's 10 years worth.
Okay. When I get to Tanzania, that's the one you really need to keep.
Oh, okay.
It's going to be me and an elephant.
Yeah.
Actually, one of my colleagues went to Tanzania maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and he said they were in like an outdoor, restaurant or cafe at the compound, and so they're sitting there. They got a bunch of elephants,
Right there.
It's like, you don't bother them, they don't bother.
They don't bother you. Oh, I found a cool trick. So all the people that are your panelists or on the agenda tonight are I automatically enable them to share screen. So it's not like, oh, can you please put someone on or everyone is good to go.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I just figured that out with 2021.
Yeah. Well, actually, I
Good
think
job, Paula.
the only
Thank
one
you.
who's making a presentation is our guest, Keith Taylor, because City Planning said that they did not intend to repeat the presentation they did last month, and nor did I expect them to. I mean, they made the presentation. I shared the presentation with the committee. The committee was supposed to review it and see if they had any questions, and our role tonight is to, is there a resolution we want to pass? And, in the context of that, I shared with the committee some of my thoughts on, what the resolution might want to, touch upon based upon what we discussed last month. We were supposed to have the Port Authority presentation, but as you know, that got canceled again. So it's just Keith presenting.
And we had the last minute cancellation from the West 183rd also.
Right. Yeah, we're not sharing yet, Keith.
Oh, okay, sorry.
He's testing, making sure.
Yeah,
but it's working, so that's good.
Yes.
Jim, we can see your jaw chewing. It's a little unflattering.
So where are other committee members?
Probably stuck in front of the TV, not realizing that it's
Yeah.
7 o'clock.
Maybe they're still chewing, so they don't want to offend Vivian.
Well, I finished my chewing, just so I wouldn't do that, and I didn't break open the leftover champagne for that very reason. I'll do it
You
afterwards.
chew champagne? How
Of
odd.
course, particularly when you freeze it.
Oh,
It doesn't
Is it-
explode in the freezer?
I'm just kidding. It's the vodka that's in the freezer.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Or gin.
Yeah, the champagne is just kind of sitting in the fridge. I think there's maybe one glass full left from New Year's Eve.
Well, they're probably watching the Capitol. We can't compete with that.
No.
Well, alternatively, they could join their 7 o'clock meeting. We could be very efficient, and we could all watch TV at 8.
That's true too.
Hi, Annie.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I was just going to try to clear my camera because I'm very blurry. So just a moment.
It's not you then?
Okay, that's a bit better.
Keith, do you remember me? I came to one of your meetings last year, Vivian Ducat, and we were
Yes.
corresponding about it.
Yes, yeah. Did you come to the presentation from the state representative from historic offices?
Yes, yes. It
Yeah,
was a winter
I remember.
thing in the church, and it was cold.
That's
Yeah.
right, very
Yeah.
much. So
So
I
what-
didn't get to say hello to everybody, but I'm
All
Keith.
right.
I'm Community Board 10 actually, so I'm a little further
Yeah,
south.
I remember that you were
Right.
an activist.
So I see Omar and Ryan as listed as participants, but they are, I guess, both their cameras and their mics are off, so they're not showing up on the screen. But Omar is a committee member, so he does need to, make himself
I think he
visible.
just did something with
I
the screen.
think no one
Online.
heard me when I said Happy New Year.
No,
I think-
I think you were muted.
Overruled.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Still can't see you though.
Yeah, no, I don't activate the camera. I'm not ready for prime time.
Well, you look great. It's a nice picture.
Appreciate it, Keith. That's from my wedding day.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm not even seeing that as my point. Typically, I see his picture.
This picture's here.
I see it.
I don't see it. I
Oh.
don't see it.
Well,
Uh,
we do.
Yeah. I'll put it in the
Maybe your
window
thing
where
is
you can see it.
defective.
I don't know. Let me try a different, well, I don't know why I don't see him.
So, if you don't mind, Wayne, how much time would you like me to devote to the presentation?
Actually, I don't know how long the presentation, is. If, is it something that is doable in sort of 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Or longer than
Yeah, I actually have something that is less than 20 minutes.
Okay.
Is that too much?
No, less than 20 minutes would be good.
Okay. So, whenever you're ready, I'll start.
Okay. Well, we don't have
Quorum.
quorum yet, although actually
need that?
we're down one person. So we're down to 7, so quorum would be 4, and we have 1, 2, 3. Actually, we do have quorum. How about that? Although I can't see Omar, but I know he's there. I'm going to log out for a second and log back in and see if that fixes this, okay?
All
So
right.
I'll be back.
We'll say we can't see Wayne.
Now we can talk behind his back.
Well, we don't know what
He's
he's
away.
listening to. I wouldn't do that, Jim.
Oh, no, we'll see when he shows up again. Then we'd be all goody goody. Oh, no, no, no.
That's what I'm like. Yeah,
You never went to school?
I did.
Oh,
How about now?
I see Chris.
How is everybody? Happy New Year.
Great. Happy New Year, Chris.
Happy
Hi,
New Year.
Chris. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I just promoted Steve, so he's on the call.
Oh, really? Where was he?
Yeah. And the attendee side.
Okay. So, we have quorum and, notwithstanding the fact that I can't see Omar at all, I know he's there. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the first land use meeting of 2021 with all that's going on in DC. We'll try to stay focused. My name is Wayne Benjamin and I, chair land use for CB12. Want to say Happy New Year to everyone and take this opportunity to have my fellow committee members introduce themselves. And I will, call you based on how I see you or don't see you in the case of Omar on my screen. So first, Jim Berlin.
I am Jim Berlin. I've been on this committee since the beginning of time.
Vivian,
Vivian Ducat, public member.
Chris,
Chris Ventura.
and I don't see Steve, but I see him listed. So Steve, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Steve Simon, member of the committee, and frankly, I haven't really been able to prepare for tonight's meeting because of the craziness going on in Washington and the fact that we have a president who's out of his mind.
Thank you, Steve. And Omar
And my name is Omar Tejada from Beyond Wayne's Screen.
from Beyond Wayne's Screen. It's not quite like one step beyond, but it's now I see you. Okay. So we've got, basically, one presentation and a follow-up from the presentation that city planning made, last month, and then old business is new business as it may come up. I just wanted to begin covering some matters of committee operations that we talked about a couple of months ago, but I just want to reinforce it. So, Chris, you are taking the minutes for this evening's meeting.
Correct.
But when we circulate to the committee, the draft minutes, it's really important for everyone to get back to us to say whether you have, comments or edits or everything is fine. And as I've mentioned in the past, if we don't hear anything, we're not clear what to make of that. Some folks say that, well, if they don't say anything, we should take it to mean that, everything's okay, but it could also mean you didn't get a chance to look at it yet. So please let us know that if you've looked at it and you have nothing to add or to change, that's your comment. Because in some cases, I will have, one or two committee members who have commented and the minutes need to be submitted in time for the general meeting. But I'm always a little, hesitant because are there other, comments coming in sort of at the last minute? So, please make every, effort to, and the same thing holds true when we circulate, the draft resolutions. Does it capture, what we discussed? Does it capture all the points we want to make relative to why we are supporting or not supporting a particular item? This way, when it is presented at the general meeting, it's clear that that resolution accurately reflects, what the committee wants it to say. I mean, we've all sat through meetings where there's like internal committee conflict on the floor because someone is saying, well, they're a committee member and the reso isn't saying, what they discussed. So I don't think we've ever had that in land use and we want to avoid that. So please just be mindful of that. On the matter of city planning's the text proposal for zoning for coastal flood resiliency. Once again, I mentioned we have Annie White and Ryan Coe. They are not making another presentation tonight. The purpose of tonight's meeting, and just to recap, as we discussed, the actual deadline for comments was December 28th. But as we discussed at the December land use meeting, we were just getting, the information at that time. It was very tight for us to do anything. And on top of that, the general meeting was happening a week earlier than it normally would. So that even cut off more time that we would have normally had. So we said the best we could do was for land use to present a resolution in January to the exec committee for it to act on their behalf. So that's what we are doing here. The committees had the presentation materials that city planning shared. We've had, since the land use meeting. I recirculated it recently just so if anyone needed to, find it. In the email that I forwarded, there was also a couple of links from city planning, but that actually just takes us to similar and more detailed presentation materials. Just really, quickly, the one pager that's on city planning's, website, the four primary goals that are outlined for the zoning for coastal flood resiliency include allowing buildings to be built proportionately, to build precautionary standards that take into account increasing flood risk, support resilient buildings that are accessible and fit with their surroundings, sounds like contextual to me, enable existing buildings to become more resilient through partial retrofits, and prepare today for recovery in the future. Those are the stated goals, but I will also point out that in the presentation made by Annie and Ryan last month, that in the efforts that were made immediately following Hurricane Sandy, the rules that were put in place, there were some loopholes in those that this zoning text amendment also seek to close, so that you can't take a certain, benefit without providing what's supposed to go along with that benefit. So I think that's also an important goal that should be noted in addition to the four that were cited. And I mean, Annie, would you agree that that is something that we should consider as being a goal of this text amendment, to close those loopholes?
Yes, certainly. That was done quite hastily, so we learned a lot of lessons from that quick post-emergency implementation.
Right. And I think the issue of enabling buildings to become, resilient or more resilient through partial retrofits. I mean, I think it's saying that instead of having to do it, all at once, to allow buildings to sort of have a plan to become more resilient and to implement those plans over time. Being president of a co-op board and dealing with capital projects all the time, I mean, capital projects, can be expensive. They're not getting any cheaper. And the ability to have a plan that is then phased in makes it more manageable than someone saying you've got to do it and you've got to do it all now. But that's a quick summary of, what the goals are. And in, my review, and once again, I circulated this to the committee, just for reference, because as we know, and as Jim Berlin will remind us, we're not supposed to have committee discussions on the, via email, but I just shared my thoughts in reviewing the text amendment, and in recalling what we discussed. There were certain things that came to mind. One was the discussion we had concerning, the FEMA, flood maps, and how in certain areas, and I think Steve and I both noticed that, the block just a few blocks south of where I live, which is Trinity Cemetery, according to the flood map, the entire western portion is in a flood zone. But if you walk by the site, and I made a point of doing that a few days ago, it's a very dramatic hill. So a part of it could be in a flood zone, if that massive, retaining wall wasn't there. But the part that is, several stories above, the level of the Hudson really shouldn't be. So we thought that it would really be necessary to reconcile the zoning and the flood maps to take into account the topography of areas so that we don't have buildings that are cited as being in flood zones based on two-dimensional maps, when in fact they are several stories above the flood zone. And that's something that we discussed years ago, actually, with Edwin Marshall, I think when the initial flood regulations were put in place. And I don't think anything's been done about that. So I think that's important. My building, for example, if I check the building department's website, is shown to be in a flood zone. But if you know the area, it's on a hill, it's several stories above the river. It's not in a flood zone, but that might impact our insurance. So that's one thing I think we should, or the text should make efforts to clarify. The other thing is to clarify what's the trigger, what minimum amount of renovation or alteration work, triggers the compliance for the new coastal regs. When we discussed it last time, it wasn't clear if any, amount of renovation triggers it, or if you have a building that's, X thousand square feet, once you hit a certain threshold, 10%, 15% of the gross, does that trigger it? It wasn't clear, but I think we need to get clarity on that. We were just talking about the expense that's involved, and, having City Hall and the Department of Finance create some, tax incentives to encourage property owners to undertake, flood mitigation retrofits, I think would be, something worthwhile. It would not be part of the zoning text amendment, but if the city wants building owners to move forward with this, the same way that we had, J51 and other, benefits to encourage folks to either build or renovate, they need to think about what you can do to incentivize folks to move more quickly with these mitigation efforts to make buildings more flood resilient. The next thing is provide, ongoing public education on flood resiliency, why it's important and what can be done, incrementally and over time to make existing buildings more flood resilient. We can always build new buildings easily, but we've got 900,000 buildings in New York City. Not all of them are in flood zones, but there are a lot based upon the material presented. People need to understand why it's important and what can be done, and that the city is not looking to displace people or property owners who have property in flood zone, but what can be done and needs to be done to make those buildings more flood resilient. I think the next item is to better coordinate the building code and the zoning resolution requirements to ensure there's consistency. I think that's also partially at the heart of what you're seeking to do, that there were some, inconsistencies between what the building code requires and what the zoning resolution requires when it comes to resiliency. And that makes it, difficult to move forward. And we just need to ensure that as this text amendment is moving forward, there are similar efforts to make sure that the building code and the zoning resolution dovetail and don't make it difficult to move forward with, efforts to make buildings more resilient. And then finally, we discussed, and I think it came up during the last conversation, I think there's the 2050 and the 2100 or the 2100 floodplain models. And it might make sense to look at, what's the projected difference between the two. The zoning text amendment, I think, is focused on making resiliency based upon the 2050 model. And I guess what would be the difference? What else would need to be done if you had to make it resilient to the 2100? Right. So, those are the things that came to mind when I looked at it. When my fellow committee members looked at the materials and thought about it, what else came to mind? And for that matter, what do you think of the points that I've raised?
Are you asking us now?
I'm asking you now. It's the item on the agenda. Yes, Vivian.
I would wonder to what extent there could be kind of model, you know, if there were a way to be a resource where people, buildings who've already dealt with it, their management or their board could become people who speak regular English as opposed to bureaucratic and land usey kind of English to sort of work with other buildings to explain what they did and what's possible. I would think that that would make it much more, if not attractive, less intimidating.
And could that be part of this whole public education forum strategy?
Why not? I mean, if people are willing to be that, yes.
Anything else? I mean, I think that'll be a suggestion for city planning to promote something like that. But in terms of what the text amendment should ensure that it addresses.
Could I ask whether Allegra Legrand is on the call? She sent us some comments, which I think she's only really qualified to discuss.
She's there as an attendee.
Yeah,
I guess Ola can promote her so she can speak. But when you said she sent us some comments, I don't recall receiving anything.
Yeah,
She can also speak by
only-
can I just interrupt for a second? She can also speak as an attendee. You do not necessarily have to promote someone to speak.
Okay, okay. Allegra, can
just
you
have to
unmute
enable her
yourself?
microphone.
Allegra?
Paula has to allow her to unmute her microphone, but then
Okay,
she'll be
well,
able to do it.
that's kind of what I said, so.
No, it's different from what you said.
No, Jim, I have no control. I can't mute anybody because I haven't muted them, so I don't have to unmute them. They have to unmute themselves from their computer.
Well, in that
unmute
case,
anybody
promote
at
her,
any
but that
time.
shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, okay, so too much back and forth. So whatever we need to do so that.
Who's the person that needs to speak that you guys can't hear?
Say that again?
Who do you guys need to hear?
Allegra.
Or unmute?
Allegra.
Allegra and Legrand.
There's only one Allegra on the list.
Yes, Allegra and Legrand.
Yes.
Now her microphone appeared, by
As
the way.
opposed to
Oh,
Allegra,
hello.
my sister. Hello, Allegra.
Okay, it let me unmute. Thank you. So thanks for letting me speak. I did have quite a few comments about this. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm on a headset. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so I am a resident of Inwood and I'm talking as a resident of Inwood, but I also have some subject matter expertise. And I am a lead author on the National Climate Assessment, the last one, and probably on the next one.
Yep, we know.
So here we go. So here are the comments that I had submitted, and I'd like to just read them out to the committee. And
could I ask a quick question, Allegra? How
I don't have your email. I don't have your email, Wayne.
No,
and I've asked for it before, and people say, like, if Wayne wants to give you his email, he will. But I do have Steve Simons, and I emailed Steve earlier today.
Did you send it, for example, to the office?
I did not, because
okay.
I have Steve Simons' email, and I forwarded Steve would be here.
Well, no,
I will send it.
Go ahead.
To the office.
No, Wayne, I forwarded them to you around 7 o'clock.
Okay, thank you. Allegra, go ahead, please.
Thanks. So here are my comments. First, when you think about zoning and you do these EIS, you can have scenarios. My first comment is that you should explicitly consider a managed retreat scenario. So not maintaining or increasing density, but actually decreasing density in the most vulnerable places. And that's something that I didn't think was addressed at all. Before I carry on, we talked a little bit about FEMA flood maps. I just want to point out that FEMA provides stuff for your insurance for flooding next year, not for 30 years out, but for next year. To get those flood flood maps for the 2050s, the 2080s, 2100s, you have to use climate models and you have to use future scenarios. And those come very handily packaged for New York City from the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And they're now in their third version, and there's a nice ArcGIS mapper, and it's super easy. Okay. So the second thing is for zoning for climate resiliency, it's not only about flood risk, but whatever you're considering, that all facets of climate change need to be considered. Surface air temperature changes, like atmospheric chemistry changes, and extreme precipitation changes, which the NPCC flood mapper actually is only looking at sea level rise around the edges, but there are places like low-lying points within the interior of New York City that are very much, they're places that can flood in extreme precipitation, and that's not considered very well. And it should be explicitly addressed. Also, so talking about whether, what year should you use? Like we have 2020s scenario, obviously we're there, 2050, 2080s, 2100s, which one should you use? I think you should link those to the type of density. So if you're doing like an R7 build, like a 28-story building, that's something that's going to be around for 100 years. And so you really should be using that year 2100 scenario. And that's very different for a new build than it is if you have a 2-story house, which the lifetime for that could feasibly only be 20 years. And you should be more conservative for new builds or for increasing density than obviously you are going to be for retrofitting. And when these things are reported, you need to be very specific because there are many scenarios. So make sure that there's very consistent labeling. When you do think about the climate risks, use intensive units, which means that you need to divide by the land area and the population so that numbers for every new development can be compared. And it doesn't matter the scale of the development. You can have values that can be compared amongst different sized events. Also, the units that are used in these could be quite confusing, and as subject matter experts required to understand like what exactly they mean. So I would suggest that when you do these zonings and you're doing environmental impact statements, the thing should be converted into a unit of dollars. You should have a conversion factor and do it. And so you should have these intensive units in dollars per person per land unit. So the NPCC pages right now are basically what was existed for the second version, and not the New York City Panel on Climate Change third version, which has a really rather extreme scenario for sea level rise in year 2100. That needs to be included there. That scenario has to do with like a sudden collapse of Antarctica, and it really needs to be considered explicitly. Also, these things are changing, they're evolving. So you should set expiration dates. So if you say this is in the 1% flood zone, you should say this is the 1% flood zone for this decade. When you just lay it out there in a changing climate, it's not very meaningful.
So is it planning for the expiration date and also periodically updating your regulations?
So I mean, the IPCC runs on a 7-year calendar, and the New York City Panel, so the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Mm-hmm.
That's for the whole globe. The National Climate Assessment is the United States level, New York City Panel on Climate Change. All these things kind of feed off the IPCC, which is on a 7-year cycle. So these things in general should be updated on about a 7-year cycle so that you're always using the most up-to-date versions. And so 1% flood risk, you should say this is the 1% flood risk for years 2015 to 2025, not leave it out there that, oh, this is the 1% flood zone.
Forever, yes.
Yeah. And those, I would say having things in decade time slices or 7-year, whatever, it's probably sufficient. So there's uncertainties in a lot of these things. So when for doing proper like risk assessments, I think having like uncertainty reporting from the get-go will just make things easier down the line when we have more certainty about how things will be evolving. I think that some of these the points about flood zones. Okay, so in addition to managed retreat, I think some of the high risk places, like we need to be able to consider lower density and whether places that we expect to have nuisance flooding like every decade, whether or not those places should be zoned in ways that are resilient without having to wet or dry proof, like parkland, which parkland can be marshland if if you get a high tide once a month, it's not a big deal. So when we allow development in flood zones, I mean that there should be a scenario developed for what the cost would be, should flood levels reach the 0.2%, or people call that colloquially the 500-year floodplain. But in a changing climate, these the colloquial terms like 100-year floodplain, they're not really sufficient because people think that's a return period, but it isn't. It's much better to say % of it happening next year. So what if you hit that 0.2% flood, what would the economic cost be if this development happens, and put a dollar figure on it. I noticed in the Inwood rezoning that there was one particular comment that stuck with me, which was that there's some sort of head-to-head between zoning for ADA and zoning for flood resiliency. So how do you move buildings up so their entrances are not going to be inundated and still provide ADA access? These two things should not be at odds, and there obviously are ways that both things can be accommodated. And it seems decidedly unfair that that kind of thing would come up in any kind of land use meeting. So we do need to have buildings entrances that are resilient to climate change, not just storm surges, but also extreme precipitation, extreme heat. And thank you guys very much for letting me drone on, and especially if Jim Berlin is on the call, for letting me go more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Allegra? Okay, can I ask a question?
Yes.
That's the reason why we are considering this matter.
All right.
Let
could
me
you-
mention, by the way, that Allegra generally, but tonight in particular, was particularly informative and helpful, and sometimes, and I think Wayne agrees with this, if we have a collegial meeting where everyone cooperates, we don't need the time limits. But when
Exactly.
things get complicated, then we have to enforce them. So
And they
in
turn
this
into
case,
Washington, DC. Yes.
you were a great asset to us, and I appreciate your input, Allegra, very deeply.
Thank you, Jim.
Steve?
Yes, Steve, question.
Yeah, I want you to elaborate on what you mean by managed retreat, and how that impacts density. I don't, I'm not grasping it. So can you explain it further?
So managed retreat means going to lower density. It means like some sites, it's just not worth the environmental and economic risk to keep them where they are, and we should retreat back. So sites that have higher density, we should convert them into things like parkland, and retreat back. So we should be planning on, we're committed to a certain amount of sea level change, so we should pull back. I can send you a lot more about that. I can send you some articles, but it just basically means considering lower density scenarios.
So are you saying that the proposed zoning doesn't provide for that, or doesn't encourage a lower density in flood zones? Is that the point?
I think, often, you consider like the status quo, you consider what the proposed zoning is, But for climate resiliency, if they are places that are at high risk, considering a managed retreat, which would be an alternate scenario of pulling back from doing further development at sites that are at particular risk for, sea level changes or for extreme precipitation, flooding. Yeah.
No, so what you're telling us is that this proposed zoning does not facilitate or does not suggest that there should be a decreased density in flood zones.
I would rephrase that question, because if I recall the presentation from December, it spoke to the number of existing buildings that are in flood zones. So managed retreat, I don't think it means that you are demolishing or eliminating existing buildings. It's saying what new development, if any, should occur in those flood zones.
Right.
But managed retreat is not. I mean, it is a little bit demolishing, but it is also like, look, if this place, like whatever building was there, has decided not to be there anymore. Managed retreat can also be saying like, look, this is a place that is going to have nuisance flooding, and we, considering, this building is turned over, this building, whatever, considering not putting something that's more dense there, pulling back. It doesn't necessarily mean demolishing, but it does mean considering pulling back. And I know that DCP folks surely are very familiar with managed retreat scenarios. It's something that climate scientists talk about a lot. So,
Are there examples in New York already of that?
of managed retreat,
Yeah.
I can't think of New York City off the top of my head, but I can tell you. So you guys may or may not know that I'm from Texas. Managed retreat in Texas is when you're on the Gulf Coast and you have a hurricane that blows through, and your house that used to be on the dunes is now in the water. Now your house, you are officially managed retreat, and instead of building that house back, we are going to. They do demolish it in those cases. There are some other scenarios, I believe, out in on Long Island. I'm sorry, I didn't look up the details of that, where they, you have communities, instead of saying build back, they get bought out, and then they let the land return to what it would be naturally. You see examples of that in the Louisiana coast, like where you have a lot of erosion.
I think that also happened in some areas of Staten Island.
Yes. So
just to jump in just this minute, because you brought up New York City examples, this was, a question we had a lot about where we encourage or permit the existing density. And, just city planning standpoint is that we have used a kind of managed retreat approach in certain individual rezonings or some of our neighborhood studies, such as in very vulnerable areas. So the Broad Channel, Hamilton Beach, the area of Staten Island that Wayne mentioned, where, we found that is truly the best management. But through this text amendment and trying to balance the fact that, we do have these, housing demands, and, for areas along Manhattan, most of that flood zone is very largely built up. What we found through our outreach and speaking with, engineering and construction experts is that we can safely be housing residents and businesses in these flood zones as long as the proper building protections are put into place, as long as those, critical services and units are placed above the flood zone. We can safely, encourage, existing in the flood zone. So that was just city planning standpoint, but certainly, the board is more than welcome to make the case that we should be thinking more critically about that in our more developed areas.
I would think,
Well, so
I would think based upon Allegra and Steve's comments, if the committee, were putting something in a resolution, it would encourage the zoning text amendment and city planning to, consider and encourage managed retreat where it's appropriate.
Well, I don't want to advocate for demolition of buildings.
But that's, Steve, that's why I said where it is appropriate. No one is saying go tear down Battery Park City.
Yeah.
I think it should just be a scenario. you don't have to say like advocate for demolishing buildings, but who on the back end of DCP is deciding whether a managed retreat scenario is appropriate or not? I have to say for people in my office, when Hurricane Sandy hit, it was jarring, not just because we saw this train wreck coming far in advance, but because we'd actually gone through this exercise in 2006, when NPCC was just in its precursor phases, talking about extreme sea level rise. And we had made all these Adobe Illustrator pictures of what it would look like if the Holland Tunnel flooded and what it would look like if Battery Park flooded. And then, New York City, they went ahead. We did huge developments in very vulnerable areas. We lost the South Street Seaport's brand new $115 million station because managed retreat was not explicitly considered for those. It was notable at the last New York City Panel on Climate Change meeting. Some speakers got up and they said, then the last time we were here, this area, which is a vulnerable area, is considerably more built up than it was the last time I was at this meeting. And I don't know that that was the outcome that I would have advocated for. So this is not advocating necessarily for demoing buildings, but advocating for having an explicit scenario where you study managed retreat and put everything like the economic costs in intensive units per person per land unit per square meter, some units that can be compared between different places. It's just a scenario. It's just a study.
And wouldn't you apply it to undeveloped sites?
I would definitely apply it to undeveloped sites. Like maybe this site, which by rights could be, a 20-story building. Maybe this is someplace that we should consider explicitly managed retreat. It's just a scenario. It's just asking for a study and for
Yeah, well, I would Wayne, I would just like to slightly broaden out the wording to maybe specify when you say where appropriate, that you specify especially undeveloped sites.
I don't see any harm in studying it and putting it out there without.
It's basically saying they should look at it and do a thorough analysis and make intelligent decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Make intelligent decisions and put them out there in the public record so there can be public commentary.
Could I ask the woman from city planning?
You mean Annie White?
Yeah, yes, Annie. I forgot.
A woman from city planning.
A man from Parks.
Yeah,
I've been called worse, so I'll respond to that.
no, there's no negative connotation to it. On the contrary, could you respond to the point she raised about ADA accessibility? How do we reconcile making buildings accessible while raising them up?
But Steve, to be fair, that comment didn't come from city planning. That came from the presentation made by the developer for that project, where they said that, on one hand, and that was, the building part that, they had to raise the building up so that it wasn't in a flood zone. But then, given, the ramp requirements for ADA, there was only a certain amount of site area for the ramp, and that limited, the run, and therefore it limited how far it could go. But it wasn't city planning saying that there were conflicts. That was the developer's team.
Well,
it's true that those words came from the developer's team's mouth. But when he said them, he said he was relaying what was told to him by DCP.
Yeah, but that's what he said. So,
so DCP defenders say it ain't true.
Okay, I'm sorry. Which development site was this?
MAD.
7th Street, right?
This.
Yeah.
This was the new build, the MAD equities, the development where, because part of it is public land, the public design commission not to report on that.
Yeah, 207th and 9th Avenue.
Yeah. So anyway, before we beat that to death, Annie, would you like?
Yeah, and I apologize, but I kind of I don't think I was in that conversation. So can someone just in a sentence say what in this scenario we told the developer they couldn't do?
Developer put the entrance to the building on the commercial side, I believe it was 10.5 feet. And it's a site that faces the Harlem River. Really, like the entrance to the building is what, maybe 25 meters from the river, very, very close.
It's
And
the entrance to the residential and the retail, all of the ground floor entrances, you know, arguably could or should be at a higher elevation, because technically, even in the analysis said, you know, in certain scenarios, you know, the retail entrances, you know, would flood, but it was in, you know, the more extreme scenarios. And the question was, well, why can't we raise the elevation of that ground floor higher so that they're completely out of, you know, the flood zone, or the flood zone as we know it? And the response was, you know, this consultation with city planning and the building department because of accessibility. That in essence is the argument, or was the argument.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm a little bit unsure what our motive there was, because we would certainly, first off, I believe it's building code to have, you know, emergency entrances, including ADA entrances, be, you know, elevated for new properties. I'm not sure what the issue there was with being able to do that in this project. So I can look into that, but I would say that this kind of trying to balance elevating entrances and providing ADA access is definitely something we wanted to address. We did that through permitting obstructions for ADA access, either ramps or lifts or other devices. Both, you know, if you have a certain public space you need to maintain, typically we you know, only permit certain obstructions, and we're saying you can do the ramp, you can do the lift, and it's not going to take away from your required, you know, public space. And also permitting them within, if you want to pull it all inside, and putting them in buildings as well. So unfortunately, I don't know this case specifically, but I think that is a very important.
So I would point out, I mean, because let's not stray too far and we're pushing 8 o'clock. Item number 5 in the list that I circulated to the committee and recirculated specifically speaks to coordinating between the requirements of the building code and the zoning resolution for this very purpose, so that one isn't impacting the ability to comply with the other. I think this is exactly what we're talking about, to make sure that the code doesn't cause there to be difficulty in compliance with zoning and vice versa. That if the aim is resiliency, that they work together.
But could we specify that that they have to take measures to ensure that ADA accessibility is still provided?
But that's required by code, Steve.
I know, but I would like to have it specified.
So we can work on, you know, the wording, but one, you know, I would say, you know, not to beat a dead horse, one of the reasons I circulated, you know, my comments for review is so that the extent to which in the week or so that they're out there, folks thought about other things. Do we want to expand upon an idea? We could have done that sort of in advance of tonight because of the short time frame we have to deal with something in January. But yes, I mean, in terms of coordinating the building code and the zoning resolution while ensuring and maintaining, you know, ADA compliance is certainly something we could add to a sentence.
Yes.
So from the committee members, you know,
let me just ask, Allegra made another point which interested me about, and I thought you picked up on it as well, making sure that there's maybe a 5-year review or some kind of regular review, depending upon revisions that are made to
periodically update your regulations. Yes, that they're not static.
Right. So do you want to use that as incorporate that as well into our resolution?
I would certainly think so.
Yeah, okay.
Wayne, I just want to point out when you get a second, there's a whole bunch of questions on the Q&A, just so you don't forget about the folks that are there
I don't, okay, what are these questions?
from the public, members of the public, from the attendee
I
side.
think
Yeah,
some
so,
of them are mine. Sorry.
right, so I mean, can we hear, we don't have the resolution on resiliency, we're discussing the resolution on resiliency. There is a, and I think some folks were on the call in December, there is a zoning text amendment. The purpose of tonight's land use committee is to pass a resolution stating land use and then eventually CB12's position on that. So, we are crafting or, will craft the resolution. There's nothing for you to hear at this juncture. My sense is, and, from my committee members, I need to hear, my sense is we obviously support the zoning text amendment focused on resiliency or, coastal resiliency, but we want to make sure that it touches upon or includes certain things. I raised certain points and shared them, and Allegra raised certain points and shared them with Steve, and then we just discussed them, and there is some overlap. So I would think the resolution would be that, we've considered X, Y, and Z, and actually, as I also shared with the committee, we looked at this matter in 2019 when the scoping was put out, and so this is the second time we're looking at it. So I would think that a resolution would say that, we support city efforts to ensure, zoning for coastal flood resiliency, and also want to state that said text amendment should include or further consider the following. And the following is what we've just discussed. From the committee members present, I mean, what are your thoughts on, that approach?
I am happy with what I have been hearing. So these additions and I think the text amendment itself is well thought out. So with our additional stuff, I'm pretty happy. I don't have anything more specific that I want to do.
Vivian, Steve, Omar?
I was going to
Chris?
say something.
Hello?
It seems like one of the comments that was made by the public, and I'm thinking about it myself, is why do we allow buildings to be built in these areas? Why? Why is that when we know that that there's such a high risk of this occurring? Just that's a question that's actually in the public, and I felt that's something that we should talk about. Why is that allowed?
Okay, there's a deadly silence. I mean, the land use committee does not, govern with that. I guess the question is from a city planning perspective. But I think that goes to what we were discussing, earlier in terms of for new construction in sensitive areas, shouldn't there be a more, detailed and thoughtful analysis of what goes there? So, I mean, that was, in part, I think the whole, managed retreat, but also what is appropriate, in sensitive areas. If you have existing buildings that are in flood zones, I don't know if anyone is advocating to, demolish them, although someone could always come up with that scenario. But I think we've already said and are including in our comments that there needs to be, a much more careful analysis of what new construction is permitted in sensitive areas.
Agreed. Thanks, Wayne.
Right, but I mean, that is part of our comment already.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted it more in terms of a clarification for those that are listening, to understand that that is being taken into account within the scope of our conversation.
I think the like explicitly considering managed retreat would cover that concern.
Right, and that's my point. So once again, committee members, Chris, I haven't heard a thing from you. Any thoughts on this?
Just like Jim, I'm in favor.
Look at mommy.
Sorry, I got a lot of background here.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've got a number of other things, including Keith waiting carefully. So it sounds like the resolution is that, we support the text amendment, subject to or conditioned on the inclusion of these points that we just discussed, which I will, outline and circulate to everyone for them to, as we said, or at the beginning of the meeting, to review and comment very quickly, because the game plan is to get this to the exec committee. Although, let me ask a question. Is city planning, will they wait until the end of January to get comments, or they want it by mid-January? Meaning, do we have time to put it before the full board, or do we have to make sure we go to the exec committee?
Yeah, we were just saying mid-January because we knew that the borough president, so we can't stop the clock. The borough president will still, their clock will start. So we were saying that deadline because they would certainly want to see the community board's recommendations. We'll accept anything up to when it comes to the City Planning Commission for a public hearing, which I believe is slated for February. So you would certainly have time to bring this to your full board, and maybe if someone from the borough, I don't know if if Tim is on, they could see a draft or something if they were interested. But
yeah, well, they'll certainly get a copy. They get a copy of all our materials.
Wayne?
Yes.
I guess the one thing that I'd want to say is that there would be enforcement of this, that it's not just the Department of Buildings would actually either penalize people or not offer permits, that it doesn't just become an intellectual exercise or a set of goals, but actually become something where there's some teeth behind it.
Well, isn't all zoning enforced by Department of Buildings?
Yes.
Annie,
But
Ryan,
is it really done?
what does that mean?
I just always think that there are workarounds, and there's stuff that might be less kosher or legitimate than this kind of thing requires. I don't know if there's a level of understanding of a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I think that, well, we can certainly add that, increased enforcement or ensured DOB enforcement. But I also think that, going back to my original comment, that there are 4 stated goals, but the 5th goal that was pointed out, that the current regulations have certain loopholes, which may be what you are referring to. And this text amendment seeks to close those loopholes. So, I mean, some of what you perceive as being, unsavory, maybe people simply saying, but the regulations say I can do this and I'm doing it.
Well, and going forward, like, this is a very serious thing now. It's not.
Yeah, I get that. So we are saying that they need to, in addition to agreeing that closing the loopholes, there needs to be greater attention to
Right.
DOB enforcement.
Right.
So if someone would like to make the resolution of, LU supporting the zoning text amendment and recommending the following considerations.
I so move.
Was that Jim?
Yeah.
That was me.
I'll second it. Vivian.
Okay, so for the committee members in favor, say or raise an aye.
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 So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Who are we missing today? Any opposed or abstaining from the committee? members of the public who wish to vote, I guess you could raise,
Wayne, I have a virtual hand up just in case.
that's what I was gonna say, that you can raise your hand. Oh, you have a hand up. Omar?
Yes, in approval.
Okay, yeah, I got you.
Thank you.
So the members of the public, I'm looking at the participants or the attendees list. Those in favor of the resolution, if you could raise your hand. I see 2. Opposed or abstaining? I don't think we have any other board members with us, although I guess, Keith, you're a member of the public, so you can, vote on this if you want to.
Wayne,
Yes. I vote in favor.
Steve, thank you.
yeah, I just noticed I got an email from Maggie Clark. Did we give her a chance to speak on this?
I thought I was looking at Maggie Clark's, questions, and can we hear the resolution on flood resiliency, and what about, our resiliency against flooding, not enhance allowing buildings in the flood? But we've been talking about all these things, have we not?
Yeah, well, I know it's.
Let me see, Steve, stop. Give me a second, see if I could do something.
Yeah,
Maggie, can you unmute now? Maggie?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, hey, that worked.
Yeah, I asked to speak at the very, very beginning of this, and I don't think anybody saw that.
Right, well, I mean, once again, we were going through as I pointed out, the committee had a job to do, and the committee was supposed to, review and comment on the materials that were circulated them, about a month ago. So we were trying to, pull those comments out of them.
So I'm speaking as a PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences, as the chair of the Inwood Legal Action Environmental Committee. And we've been putting together recommended legislation for the last couple of years. And we actually spelled out in proposed legislation that we're going to be, asking for, on managed retreat. We spelled it out. And step 1 is don't build there. If there's an established floodplain, it makes very little sense to put a building that could last 100 years into that floodplain. It's not a matter of just retrofitting, because retrofitting a building assumes that flooding is just something that we're not going to be paying much attention to. It's just, we should be trying to avoid building in a place that we know will flood. The second aspect is once you've stopped building in floodplains, and by the way, Inwood is 1/3 in the floodplain now, and will be 1/2 in the floodplain in the future. So it's very important for CB12. The second point is that then the second part of managed retreat is to offer buyouts. And we've got a number of jurisdictions that we've found that offer buyouts for people who own properties in the floodplain. And that's another way to get buildings out of the floodplain. I'm not seeing what the Department of City Planning has done is really looking to that as the goal. It's more looking as how do we keep as many buildings as possible in the floodplain in as good condition as we can keep them, as opposed to trying to move away from the encroaching sea, which is happening and will be happening more. That's what I have.
Yeah, and I think in our prior discussion on managed retreat, we emphasized that, and one of the points that we will include is that further or much more attention needs to be given to thorough analysis of, managed retreat and the economic impact, and to have, intelligent, informed decisions made, that take those factors into account. So that's already part of what we're stating in our reso.
But again, especially with reference to undeveloped sites.
Steve, yes, I mean, we said that, but the extent to, as I said, the extent to which the city or state of New York wants to come up with a plan where they will buy out an existing building in a flood zone. When I say a building, I don't mean a farmhouse, I mean an apartment building. If they want to come up with scenarios where that is, financially feasible, I mean, that can be part of their analysis. We are not limiting them.
Well, but that doesn't apply to an undeveloped site. I'm not.
No, Steve,
You don't buy somebody out if there's nothing there.
but the undeveloped site is one scenario. The other scenario is, going back to the discussion last month, is in New York City's current flood zones, there are, thousands of existing structures.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the city and or the state might consider is maybe in some of the more sensitive areas, do they want to try to buy out buildings in those areas? And maybe in higher density areas, it may not make as much sense, but I was working on a project in Staten Island along South Beach, so made more trips to Staten Island than I have in my entire life. There were a lot of, 2 and 3 story buildings that are, spitting distance from the water that could more economically be, bought out and, demolished, people moved. And in some cases, a block or two away is a much higher elevation. So there are things that can be looked at with existing buildings, but the point is, we're not saying you must do this, but we're saying, what I'm hearing is, it's something that you could consider.
Well, I thought we did that after Sandy. Didn't we buy some people out on Staten
That was
Island?
a voluntary buyout. That was the problem. It was a voluntary buyout in Sandy. And the thing about 9th Avenue and 207th Street, that's definitely in the floodplain. And the buildings that are there are only, I think, 1 story high. And it looks like there are going to be 30-story buildings put in the floodplain that'll probably last for 100 years.
Right. So we have discussed, and I will have to draft, although not as quickly as we thought, the resolution that includes all of these points for the committee to review and comment, to make sure that we've captured all of it. Annie, thank you for saying that, we've got the time to take it to the full board so that, everyone has a greater opportunity. And, with that, I want to, thank everyone for the discussion on this text amendment. And also I want to thank Keith for his, patience, and take us to the next agenda item. And as Keith Taylor mentioned, he is with CB10. And so you might say, as my fellow committee members, we've got a guest from CB10, and he's talking about a proposed historic district that's in central Harlem. Why is that of concern to Washington Heights and Inwood? And as he gets into it in more detail, this year that has passed has been, quite a, reckoning on racial justice, as among other things. If you look at all of the historic districts that are in the city of New York, I don't believe there is one that is named for or in honor of an African American. And this Dorrance Brooks Square Historic District in Central Harlem would be the first. And, given the attention that CB12 has given to planning and historic preservation issues as they pertain to people of color in our neighborhood, I thought we'd be interested in hearing what's going on in our neighboring community, and potentially also supporting their application for that area to be declared a historic district. And so with that, I turn the floor, or the screen as the case may be, over to Keith Taylor.
Well, I thank you, Chair Benjamin, and the Land Use Committee. I am a colleague in arms at CB10, I'm on the land use committee there, been there on CB10 for 12 years. And so I'm very, very familiar with, you know, the meetings that last long into the evening, discussing things that will continue on for time immemorial. And so my focus on the board has been in public safety. I was a police law enforcement person for about 23 years, and corrections commissioner for about 2. And also in education, my formal terminal degree is from Columbia in Teachers College with a doctorate in education. And so I've been active on the board as well as on other boards in that regard. And landmarks, I kind of sort of fell into. It was something that I did not realize how passionate I was about. And so in 2008, when 125th Street had its rezoning, they realized that there was a concern about development of the neighborhoods to out of context character. And there were a lot of historic sites that were worth preserving. So they came up with this idea of having a historic preservation plan, of which I've emailed some of you. I'll be glad to, if you just Google CB10 Historic Preservation Plan, the PDF pops right up.
The document that you shared with me, Keith, I shared with the committee.
Wonderful. So in it, it's a how-to. I'm sure, I mean, this is a very learned group here who, you know, you all know your ins and outs of land use and landmarks. And so I literally am just speaking with colleagues here. If there's anything that you find of use, but I can tell you the motive, the incentive behind that was developing areas of Harlem that should be preserved before they were gone forever, frankly. And so that is what we have been doing, been implementing this plan over the past 10 years. And we've gotten, I think, the 2 that we're about to get considered by landmarks, city landmarks. That would be the 3rd and the 4th of the 9 that we've identified. And so landmarks is, of course, very slow. Requires a lot of influence, a lot of patience, and so what I've done, in the interest of time, I have I gave a presentation in July to the Historic Districts Council for their 50th anniversary. That is what I have on the share screen.
Actually, you haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, sorry. It is about 20 minutes long. I thought I had 10 minutes, and so it's a 10-minute presentation. Then I realized I had another 10. So then I go into more detail about this case study of Central Harlem and its relationship to everything from the civil rights movement to the Harlem Renaissance to the architectural treasures that exist, which are very much threatened. And so I can play that now, but it's also available online. So if you prefer that I play it and be available to answer questions, or if you prefer that.
If it's available online, we could do that. Why don't you give us sort of the highlights and, what makes the Dorrance Brook Square, what is important. Now, who's the person, what's the association, what's, what's the context, what?
Yes. So Dorrance Brooks was a World War I soldier. He, with a lot of Black and brown young men during that time of Jim Crow, had the audacity to prove to the world that African Americans and Latinos were just as capable of bravery and loyalty as soldiers fighting for democracy in this country as anybody else. And so during the time of Jim Crow, there was a sentiment that, the African American would not make a good soldier. So they were very much, they had a great deal to prove. And so they went overseas, they fought valiantly, and there are a lot of things that they did, much like the Tuskegee Airmen and, so on. But Lawrence Brooks did not make it better. He died fighting valiantly on the battlefields of France. In 1925, 7 years after the war ended, he was honored by the city with a park. It's a square on 135th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue. And that square, that park, it's an entrance to the uptown side of the BC line. And it's Lawrence Brooks Square. 1925, 14,000 people, I think, showed up. The mayor gave a speech about I don't want to misquote him, but basically talking about the bravery of the Negro soldier and how that was incorporated in the life of this young man who was a Harlem native, and his father, in fact, was a Civil War veteran. So he's fighting for freedom, generations ago. And so Lawrence Brooks, I saw in that young man, really the story of the African American in this country, and fight for freedom despite all this, the difficulties and challenges that were set before him. And so the effort to get historic designation was really started with the Historic Districts Council coming to a block association meeting and explaining the possibilities of what could be to preserve our beautiful 130-year-old buildings of various types of styles that were popular at the time, the Queen Anne and all the other styles, the churches and other buildings. And so we set about getting this done. We ended up first hiring a architectural, a historic preservationist, an architect who created the application that we sent to the state, and it was approved in no short order by both the state historic district and by the federal, the National Park Services.
Frozen.
You're frozen for a second, Keith, or you're still frozen. Whoops.
Did we lose him completely?
I don't know. He is frozen.
Or best to sign off and get back in.
Oh, maybe that's what he's doing.
When he comes back, could you ask him to show us a map that shows the boundaries of the district?
Sure. Although that may be in the document I sent you, but never mind.
When did you send it? I don't remember seeing it.
I sent it in December or maybe even in late November, because initially he was going to meet with us earlier. Keith, you're back. Actually, Steve asked if you could pull up a map that shows the boundary of the proposed district. So maybe while you're speaking, we could have that as a visual. And you're muted.
Okay, I'm back. So I can, unfortunately, the computer that I've had some technical difficulties, and so the computer that I normally have everything on is not connected to the internet. And so that's why I said, well, let me just have the presentation I gave. It has everything on it.
Right. So as I was saying, Steve and everyone else, as I mentioned, the presentation, the complete presentation document that Keith sent to me, I shared with the committee. So if you check your email,
You'll
from
see it in
probably,
there.
close to Thanksgiving, you have it, but I'm more than happy to resend it. Keith was actually going to come to, I believe it was the December meeting, which is why you have it from back then, but we rescheduled to January.
All right, I'll look for it.
And I would love to just give you the web page, the YouTube page for the presentation.
Sure.
If I can, is it in chat? I'm having a little bit of
Yeah.
difficulty.
Well, you know, if you email that link to me, I will make sure everyone gets it.
Okay, yeah, then that's what I'll do.
Yeah, that's better.
Because it can be a little bit hard to find within the Historic District Council.
Right. So
district
before
website.
you froze, you were saying that, I guess it's CB10 Hyde and the architect, they put together the plan, they submitted it to, you know, the state, I guess that's SHPO.
Yes,
It was reviewed and approved by SHPO.
yes, in 6 months. And it was
Park
unanimous.
Service, you said, National Park.
And then the National Park Service a few months later. And I was very happy to see that they did that. The problem with Upper Manhattan in general is that we have a lot less designated for you know, landmark status than the other parts of the city.
Absolutely.
So we don't have our important structures protected in that way. We can very easily lose the identity of the community to development. And so that is certainly a, you know, Harlem being a important place for a lot of reasons, but so is every place else in the city. So there are certainly, I'm sure, places you could easily identify off the top of your head that should get this designation, but is currently vulnerable. And so, you know, it's the threat of not climate change, but of development, the fierce incentives for that to occur.
Right. And I think the critical thing to emphasize, I'm sure everyone remembers, is that, you know, while National Register listing is nice, it doesn't provide the same level of protection against demolition as city designation.
Demolition or alteration.
That's right. Yeah, as a matter of fact, there are New York City's 1965 creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission was the most protection that was you know, at that time.
Yeah.
And then the state came later with less protection. As a matter of fact, very little in comparison. And then the federal came after that, and that has the least protection. So basically, it allows a neighborhood or community to say, yes, we're on the national list, but there's no reason why that can't be completely raised for some, you know, development.
Right. And so I'm assuming that's the impetus behind CB10 wanting to move from just having state and national register listing to have the district be a New York City historic district.
Yes, and so it identified the 9 most important areas for consideration, of which Landmarks Preservation Commission has repeatedly stated that they really, really appreciate the document and they use it to help with their work. So it's much better for it to be an organic creation coming from your board than it is for it to be coming from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. So where's the application in the process? What is LPC saying? You mentioned it could take a long time. I know the Audubon Park District where Vivian and I live, that took what?
6 years.
6 years. That was considered quick.
Yes.
Hey, I live there too.
And Steve.
Yeah, it was first, the area was first considered in 1984.
Okay.
But yeah, but they didn't do anything back then. I wasn't there back then, so I don't know the history behind that. But they have, for the past 2 years, been looking at it ever since the state, you know, took an interest, and so they, as far as I can see, they're moving in warp speed. And perhaps too, it's the significance. I think they want to time it with the Harlem Renaissance, which is, you know, 100 years.
Yeah,
So,
that's right now.
Right.
And I also mentioned that it would be the first time that a historic district was named after an African American, and you know, one of great stature in my eyes, defending the country, given the times where the country did not defend him.
And still doesn't.
Well, it's fortunately we have a country that can improve.
This is true. So is there a resolution that CB 10 passed supporting this that you can share with us that we can reference?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can do so quite easily because I was the one who
wrote it
very enthusiastically writing it, wrote it rather. So yeah, I'll be glad to send that along with the link to the presentation, which I think you'll find interesting.
Yes,
I go into the history of the Harlem Renaissance and all the great artists that have come of that, and the civil rights movement, and all the significant things. The Brown versus Board of Education, and Thurgood Marshall and his mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston, who there was a movie about him, the man who killed Jim Crow.
Right, right.
So there's a whole lot of history packed up in this little part of town, and I'm sure that you have equivalent community, areas, neighborhoods in your boards.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the argument we make all the time, that there is, a tremendous amount of history uptown. I mean, if you look at CB 12, the Morris Mill Mansion, there was someone known as George Washington who
Yes.
used that as, his headquarters during a little skirmish called the Revolutionary War.
That's right.
But there are certain, historical links to this country. And while, it's designated, it is often difficult to get, the historic, cultural significance of places or of Manhattan designated. And, if you read the minutes of the last, 4 or so committee meetings, you'll get a sense of, that. And most recently, a building that is tied to, what to our knowledge was an uptown abolitionist colony, LPC saying, well, that's nice, but the building's changed, so it's not important enough. And it's like, it's not the architecture that makes it important. It's its connection to having been built by an ardent abolitionist who was thrown out of his church for being so anti-slavery.
Wow.
But to them, it was more the architecture and less the historic significance. So you're absolutely right. There is tremendous amount uptown that merits consideration, that merits recognition, that we need to fight to ensure that attention is given.
So what the community board did in the creation of this document was it did get an urban fellow to work on it as an internship in connection with a committee, which if you look on the first page of the document, you'll see all the different folks who had a hand in it. So it was a labor of love, and it used the best information from the best minds, and certainly I think it's worthy of your efforts.
Keith, your neighbor, Joe Linda Ruth Cogan, has spoken to me about the historic district. And I can't remember, I was with her a few weeks ago. I can't remember whether she told me whether the park itself is incorporated into the historic district. Is it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, I work for the Parks Department, so that may be
Mr. Simon, I've seen your name quite a bit. I think we might have corresponded a little bit about the park.
Yeah, no, if you
I was
remember
just trying to place you. I was like, I know Steve Simon, just can't remember from where.
Well, because a few years ago, I helped you get the historical sign replaced.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So we know each other. So I support your efforts, but I'm not sure I can vote on the resolution because of the fact that the park is involved. Now, I have no issue with the park being included, but I think Jim, what do you think about that?
I'm not quite sure. You mean we're not going to vote on his resolution because it's not in our district?
Well, no, but we would vote on a resolution supporting their efforts to get it designated.
I believe that's not the role of our community board. We are,
Well, Jim,
allow me to finish if you don't mind, and then you can go on with your incorrect interpretation. Community boards are
my
supposed to
correct
be, if you
interpretation.
don't mind, are supposed to be totally parochial. And the only time that I remember that we ever commented at all on an adjacent community board is when something occurred on 155th Street, which we share. So from my point of view, when we can check with other authorities, if you like, we should not be passing a resolution on something that's happening in some other district that is presumably not on our border with it. That is my view.
Yes, thank you, Jim. And going to my incorrect interpretation, I can think of at least 2 occasions in the past where we were asked by neighboring community boards, and I think in one case it was CB9 with the Manhattanville plan. It was presented to us and they asked for our support, and Jim made similar comments. And, we said there are similar challenges, whether it's CB9 or CB12, and those challenges, those forces that impact development don't respect community district boundaries. And we supported CB9 in their efforts to advance, their planning efforts regarding Manhattanville. And I think the other one might have been the Take Me to the River initiative. So that's CB9 in 2 occasions. So I don't see, and my fellow committee members, can give their opinion. I don't see a problem in Community Board 12 saying that, we are advocating for historic preservation. We recognize that, the historic preservation as it pertains to Uptown and as it pertains to people of color, has been sorely underrepresented. And while this district is not in our district, we support their efforts to get it designated.
And we could learn from them, perhaps.
And we could learn from them.
And even if it were not a resolution, if it were just a letter.
Yeah,
we can't. We're not allowed to write letters.
Yeah, so
we have to
not a
pass
resolution.
resolutions. The issue is I've got no problem with learning from them. And, I sort of see your point. If another community board solicits our opinion, the board itself, then we could do something as a board maybe. But and again, I'm obviously not, denigrating you, Mr. Taylor, but, you at this point in time, I believe, are an individual. So based upon your thoughts, which are quite excellent, I don't think we should be, reaching into a community district that didn't ask us to comment on what they were doing. And that's just my view.
Yeah, I understand, but let me clarify that because, and Keith, you can get back to us on this. I mean, are you personally asking CB12 or is CB10 asking CB12 to support?
It would be me, and it would be in the role as the longtime president of the Dorrance Brooks Square Block Association, because of Board 10 to go through those channels. And I have actually been on deployment with the Guard, with the State Guard, since March of last year. Operation COVID-19, and so I have not been in communication with the chair of 10 about reaching out to any other boards. And so I come to you as I have a few hats. I come to you as the Block Association president in asking for support for our efforts with LPC to get city landmarking, because we need as much support as we can get. It is
I want to make an additional point so it's, you understand the breadth of what I'm saying. If, part of your initiative is the general initiative of, people in Northern Manhattan to, work against the fact that we are so underrepresented, that is something I think we as a community board have already mentioned, in our discussions at the very least. And that sort of thing, I think we could support because it's more general. But again, a district somewhere else, that I'm not so sure. And again, we can check, And again, you know, I believe you see where I'm coming from. I want to be totally supportive insofar as we're allowed to be. But if you look and then, listen to the borough president's training and stuff, you know, our sole purpose is to advocate for our people in our district.
Yeah,
You know,
we can
that's-
check with the borough.
Oh,
president
absolutely.
On that,
You know.
and we can also check with, the chair of the appropriate people at CB 10, because I was the last couple of weeks in I was going to say a meeting, in some kind of a virtual, meeting with a bunch of them. But I would say, well, putting aside the issue of a formal resolution, what is the sense of the committee in terms of its thoughts and support for this initiative?
I would be in support of it if it was allowed.
Well, not if it's as allowed in terms of a resolution. In general, what are your thoughts about, the proposed district and whether this is something that, is worthy of, because we can individually, write letters of support, what are your thoughts on that? I will check with the borough president's office. I'm pretty certain that when we were advocating for the designation of the United Palace, we got formal written support from CBs 9 and 10. So, I mean, being reciprocal is not a problem, but I will check with them on this. But I want to get a sense of the committee so that moving forward, we know what to do.
I mean, we're a shared community in some ways. I mean,
Yeah.
these political boundaries are very arbitrary, and we're sort of out of mind because we're north of, I don't know what, 110th Street or something. So we're in the same out of mind world that you are, Keith.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's certainly a commonality to this issue.
Yeah.
And
Well, if we go back to, and it's going back quite some time, to when Ruth Messenger was borough president, Michael Henry Adams, who you probably know, put together a presentation called Heritage on the Heights that was hosted in her office for some time, and it might have then moved to a couple of other areas. And, that was a time when there were even fewer buildings designated uptown, and there was even less interest. It was a real fight. And the point that Vivian just made is exactly that. There are buildings designed by the same architects, and the Beaumont here on Riverside Drive, it has a twin downtown, and you can have the same architects involved. You get buildings that are equally as interesting, but if they're uptown, they're not worthy. If they're downtown, it's a no-brainer. And there's something just basically, discriminatory and racist about that, to be frank. So we need to be mindful of that.
Indeed. I think certainly the fact that some parts of Upper Manhattan have been undeveloped, really not noticed for many years, has led us to the point now where we have these beautiful buildings that are still relatively intact.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's incumbent upon us to preserve what we can for future generations so they can appreciate and understand the history of the city, the history of the people that inhabited it, and the wonderful things that they did, the important things that they did. They should be remembered.
I agree.
So, Omar, Chris, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm in support of it. I think along the lines of what you just mentioned, that there seems to be a barrier, so to say, to getting these type of designations in Uptown. One is not surprising to me. There always seems to be some type of barrier when it comes to enacting things that we want up here. So I'm in full support of it. But along the same lines is we just had not too long ago the and forgive me for for not getting the name correct, but we had the thought process of designating Washington Heights also as a cultural kind of center for immigrants from the Dominican Republic as well. So we seem to have this kind of like momentum to kind of recognize not just from a cultural aspect this neighborhood, but also how can we protect it in other ways. And I'm in full support of this. Anything that kind of cements legacies in our communities, I'm in full support for 100%, because we don't have enough of those protections here.
Chris?
I am in support. Sorry for being extremely vague. I have a 2-year-old.
Not a problem.
She's actually
if
quite
I could
awake.
just, amplify, because again, I agree with what everyone is saying. If we want to pass a resolution supporting the fact that finally more and more places are being designated in northern Manhattan, this desert of history, or this desert of history they're trying to create by not designating things, I think that's, again, a general thing, and it benefits us. And insofar as this district,
Is an example.
Not only is it an example, insofar as there is such a district in our neighboring district, such an historic district, the mere fact there's one more district benefits us because, among other things, we can go there. And it also benefits us because it raises the odds that we will get more such districts, and again, the whole idea of these districts is to preserve history by getting people to come and visit and learn of the history. So again, I'm trying, insofar as we reach out and go, we like that district there or if we were to comment on something in Staten Island, and certainly unbidden, but if we were asked, that I think, consistent in what you, Wayne, were saying, that's sort of more consistent in what we were doing. We were invited to join them and that's a whole other story. It's just the concept of reaching out and then talking about something in another district that has nothing to do with us. And, I just pointed out, of course, that it has a great deal to do with us. So,
Well, that's an interesting way we can phrase it. We can say that, the Land Use Committee and CB12 support the designation of individual landmarks and historic districts in Upper Manhattan that recognize, preserve, and cement. I like that, concept, almost cement the legacy of our communities. And that's the basic resolution. And in the whereas, we could say, for example, we could talk about things that we're doing, and we could also talk about in the neighboring district, how this, proposed district would be, it's currently a National Register district. That would be the first New York City historic district that is named for an African American. What are thoughts on that, committee?
I think that sounds good.
So should we say
For Keith.
it was moved by Jim and seconded by Vivian?
I'll take that.
Does that
I
sound
have
good to
no
you, Keith?
problem with that. And then you will put all the beautiful words together.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, committee members in favor, say aye, raise your hand.
I raise your hand.
1, 2, 3, 4. Omar and Chris, how are you doing?
Aye in favor.
Okay. Any opposed?
In favor.
Okay. Any members of the public, although the only members of the public left are our city planning reps?
Wayne, I think I have to be marked down as not voting. Oh, what the hell? Forget it. I vote in favor.
Right. Because basically we're not talking about that district. Remember,
Right.
the resolution is of designation of uptown landmarks and historic
Okay, very
districts.
good. Very good. You convinced me.
Okay. So is there any, of course, that's outside. Can you hear that, Vivian, from your home?
Yes,
Okay.
very loudly.
Yes, that's right outside my window, all day long. Any old business?
Yes. Is there an update about that Inwood office building, whether it's making a presentation?
I haven't heard from Domingo.
Okay.
I will reach out to him.
Okay. Is this because of the narrowed street in front of your building?
Yes.
I think so.
But what happens is because of the work on Riverside Drive, it seems that there's more backup on 157, and I face 157, and I'm working from home since March, and I can't tell you the amount of noise. It was never like this before.
It was with the buses that we're talking, so that you just weren't there for that.
Yeah, well,
Okay. I have a couple of points under new business.
go ahead.
What do you think of the idea of inviting the developer of the RKO Coliseum site to come to the committee and ask him to make a presentation about what his plans are for that site?
Do we have that information?
I actually have that information. This is Chris. I will reach out.
Right.
The developer, by the way, their name is BLBG Management.
BLBG?
BLDG.
As in building.
Oh, building. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
are you working for them?
No,
Oh, okay.
thank God.
Chris, you're going to outreach to them?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
It sounds like a wonderful idea.
And there's another development project that apparently is now planned for Broadway and Nagel at 4560 Broadway. Does anyone have any information about that project?
I do not.
All right.
I do as well. Yes. My line of work. Right at the corner. I'll
Yeah.
reach out to them as well.
Yeah, it's currently a parking lot.
Right.
Okay, great.
It's to be a residential building with commercial or
And mixed
community.
use, yeah.
Do you have contact information for that?
I don't know the developer's name off top, but I actually do have a contact.
Okay, if you could reach out to them and we could potentially get an informational presentation from them as well, that would be great.
Will do.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other new business? Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I second the motion.
Yes, in the hope that Joe Biden has now been accepted as on president.
Not yet,
Not yet?
no.
Oh,
But
God.
some of the Republicans sound like they've come to their senses.
Oh, thank God, okay.
Yep. So it's 8:52. Good night, all.
Take
Bye.
care. Good,
Thank you.
And please remember, as the resos and the minutes come around, please be sure to provide your comments.
Send us the link again to the Doris Brooks presentation. I
Yeah,
can't,
actually, it wasn't the link, it was the whole PDF. I will resend it, yes.
yeah, I can't find it.
And I'll send the link to the PowerPoint presentation I did momentarily. too.
Okay, and I'll forward it to the committee.
All right,
Fantastic.
Keith,
Thank you.
could you say hello to Joe Linda for me?
I know her.
I will absolutely do so.
Good person.
Yes,
All right, thank you.
yes.
Have a
Good
good
night,
night,
all.
everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Right.
Good night.
Here.
Good night.